Someone Like You by Sparkypasker. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 43. Katsuki walked down the sidewalk, swinging his arms wide to prevent them from knocking into his hips. He had done that often enough to know it eventually left bruises. He wasn't a fan of the support course kids. They were a little creepy. But maybe he would have to talk to someone about making his grenadiers smaller without compromising their power. Walking with Mirio-senpai was always a headache. He was constantly getting stopped on the street by people wanting his autograph or his picture. They wanted to congratulate him for winning the third-year sports festival. It actually made Katsuki a little sick to his stomach. This was the part of heroing he absolutely despised. Why couldn't they just go fight the villains? Why did they have to play nice for the crowd? This was something he had spoken with his therapist about in length, and they could never really come to a good middle ground. His therapist emphasized the importance of a hero is to make people feel safe, and that heroes accomplish that by interacting with the public. Katsuki thought that was just stupid. The best way for people to feel safe is for them to actually be safe. This had happened at his last appointment, and Katsuki wasn't sure he wanted to go back. The look the therapist gave him after he said that caused shivers to go down his spine. He didn't take well to being pitied. What was wrong with saying he would defeat all the villains? That he would be the best and no one would ever be able to match up to him? Once his appointment was over, Katsuki had told Night Eye to find him a new therapist. This wasn't the first time he had switched, and he was sure this wouldn't be the last. But this one was the one he had spent the most time with. He wasn't looking forward to having to spill his guts out to a new one. They all asked the same questions at the beginning, and he kept having to admit to the atrocities he had committed. It was like they couldn't just let it go. They had to keep bringing it up. It was done. It was over. Midoriya was even in the hero course now. Didn't that mean it was over? Night Eye told him his past was never going to go away, that it was going to take a long time for him to pay for his crimes. But why? It was over, wasn't it? Wasn't it? Katsuki was forced out of his spiral by Mirio-senpai discreetly tugging on the hem of his shirt at the waist. He began following Mirio-senpai once again. Either way, Night Eye was probably going to tell him the same thing he always did. It's okay if you want to switch to another therapist, but don't make the decision rashly. They are people too. Use until your next session to decide if their transgression was truly because they don't understand you or if maybe there was a misunderstanding. Of course, there was that one time with one of the first therapists that outright verbally assaulted Katsuki. It was during a time when Night Eye still went with him to make sure he actually attended and spent the hour sitting in the waiting room. The guy was an idiot and couldn't control the volume of his voice. Night Eye heard everything he said to Katsuki and got the guy's license revoked. Turns out he actually had a history of pushing his clients towards villainy rather than away. After that, the therapists they tried were thoroughly vetted. The most recent one was the one he liked the best so far, and he had been with the longest. Night Eye has told him, after he left the last therapist he actually liked, that because therapists are people too, they use their own set of values and morals when listening and making recommendations to their patients. They have assumptions developed from their own lives and assumptions they have learned through school or work experience. This all shapes how they do their job. This is also why not one therapist is perfect for everyone. Oh, but he hadn't left that last one because of anything bad. He had retired. Katsuki was actually thankful his previous therapist had recommended his current one. It saved him a lot of headache and time going from person to person to find someone who fit. Maybe he would give it a little more thought. The two heroes turned a corner and began walking down towards a less populated area. Now, quote, less populated was actually a bit of a stretch. Musafu was a city almost as populated as Tokyo. Something being less populated but still on the outskirts of a shopping district simply meant they were no longer walking while bumping into the shoulders of civilians. They could actually walk side by side rather than Katsuki following Mirio-senpai around like a duckling. Katsuki was so far in his head, he was nearly bowled over when a small being emerged from the alley he was passing and ran into him. The jar of the impact brought him back to reality, reached his hand down to grab the back of the person's shirt. Then he instinctively went to throw the person away from him, but stopped himself at the last minute when he realized there was no danger. He took a moment to observe the clearly frightened girl hanging from his fist. She looked at him with wide red eyes, glistened over with tears. But he could tell she refused to let them fall. But that didn't stop her from curling up in a ball, all while still hanging in the air. The next thing he noticed was that he was, in fact, not holding on to a shirt, or at least not a child's shirt. It looked like the child was actually wearing a shirt meant for a teenager or a small adult. It was thin and worn out, almost to the point of being called ragged, and hung past her knees. She may have been curled into a ball not only because she was scared, but also to keep herself from falling out of the shirt. She was without shoes, so it wouldn't be a stretch to believe she was also without undergarments. But Katsuki sure as hell wasn't going to check. Hey, Katsuki, maybe now would be a good time to put her down? Mirio-senpai said, hands raised, poised to catch the child if Katsuki were to actually decide to throw her. Katsuki lowered the girl to the ground and looked at her a little closer. Now that she was uncurled, he could see that she had long silver hair. His head started to itch when it looked at just how greasy it was. He could tell it had been quite some time since it had been washed. There were small mats forming at the scalp, and although it may have been a trick of the light, he thought he saw small black spots between the strands of hair. It was only when she lowered her arms away from her face that Katsuki was able to see a small horn protruding out of one side of her forehead and the wraps covering her arms and legs. The sight of them shook Katsuki. The silver-haired, red-eyed little girl was replaced with a green-haired, green-eyed boy wearing identical wraps, hiding bright burns from sight. Katsuki shook his head to dispel the image. Hey, kid. What do you think you're doing running into me like that? Didn't your parents teach you to look where you're going? He said roughly. Katsuki, that was kind of harsh. Mirio-senpai chided. Not at all, young man. A gravelly voice echoed from the depths of the alley. Katsuki looked up, only to see a slender man, looking to be in his late 20s or early 30s, with short black hair, wearing a coat with a fur-ringed collar, and a mask in the shape of a bird's beak. I have tried to teach her proper manners, but kids. The man shrugged, hands in his pockets. You this kid's dad? Katsuki questioned. The last time Katsuki had seen a mask like that was in a history book. Yeah, that's right, the Birdman said, walking toward them a few more steps. Well, no one was hurt, Mirio-senpai said cheerily. Don't be too hard on the girl. Accidents happen. That they do. Now, come along, Eri. Time to go home. The man took his hands out of his pockets and held them towards the girl. Katsuki noticed they were covered with pristine white gloves. This guy must have been a serious germaphobe. The girl, Eri, reached out and grabbed hold of Katsuki's pant leg. She gripped the fabric tight enough to turn her knuckles white. Katsuki watched Eri stare at her father with a look of terror. He enclosed his fist around her trembling hand. She looked up at him, the terror ebbing slightly. Bird Guy stared pointedly at their clasped hands, then turned around and walked deeper into the alley. He fiddled around with the cuff of his glove. Step into the alley, would you? I would rather not have my daughter make a scene where everyone can see her, and our conversation doesn't need to be on the sidewalk," he said politely. Katsuki looked up at Mirio-senpai, who looked back at them with a small smile and stepped into the alley. Katsuki reluctantly followed behind, Eri in tow. Once the trio stepped into the shadows of the alley, Birdface's voice turned sickly sweet. "Now, Eri, you don't want to inconvenience these nice heroes. Ah, I just realized I haven't gotten your names yet. What agency are you with?" he asked, as if making small talk. "It's no inconvenience," Mirio said cheerfully. "I'm Lemillion, and we are just students. We wouldn't dare associate ourselves with any agencies." "Well, I'm sure it won't be long before agencies will be looking for you left and right," he said while pulling on his gloves and flexing his fingers. Katsuki felt Eri flinch and quickly shook off his hand, which was still closed around hers. Before Katsuki could grab her, she was gone from his reach, and her hand was clasped tightly within her father's. "That's a good girl, Eri. Now let's go," he said, yanking her by her arm back down the alley. Katsuki and Mirio-senpai watched them leave. Neither took their eyes away from the figures until they had disappeared from sight. Katsuki couldn't get the girl's terrified face out of his mind. He shouldn't have let her just walk away like that. There was obviously something wrong, but Mirio-senpai hadn't said anything. So maybe he was wrong? But she reminded him so much of someone else. But who? Where had he seen someone like that before? Eri's pale skin became littered with freckles as her eyes turned green. Katsuki's eyes widened in horror. It was Midoriya. Midoriya had looked like that as a child. In fact, Midoriya still looked like that to a certain degree. As a child, he was always covered in bandages from Katsuki's burns and other injuries caused by their classmates. Now he had less bandages, but he was still nearly bone wrapped in a thin sheet of skin. If it weren't for the persistent layer of baby fat on his face, his eyes would be sunk further into his skull than they already were. Suddenly, Katsuki's mental picture of Eri's father became a red-eyed blonde with a vicious smile. Small explosions tore apart the white gloves encasing his hands. But if Katsuki's gut was right, which it always was, then Eri was being hurt by her father. That would mean her father was a villain. And if Eri reminded Katsuki of Midoriya and Katsuki himself was her father, then that would make Katsuki a villain. And Eri was still with her father. As long as he was around, she would continue to be tormented. Katsuki's stomach nearly flew out of his mouth when Mirio-senpai tapped him on his shoulder. He jerked his head in Mirio-senpai's direction. Mirio-senpai looked at him. "We need to get back to the office. We have to report this to Sir. Now," he said urgently. Katsuki followed behind as Mirio-senpai ran back in the direction of the agency. Based on Mirio-senpai's reaction, Katsuki believed he would be seeing Eri again. This wasn't over. Midoriya's face flashed in Katsuki's mind. That's right. It wasn't over, and it wouldn't be over until the villain faced justice. Chapter 44. Ever since Midoriya Izuku was arrested, Shigaraki has been going psychotic. It took all of Magna's patience to keep him from disintegrating their entire base. And it was brand new. Well, as new as an old warehouse could be. New to them. Yeah, that was the phrase. Dabi, on the other hand, went silent. And that was nearly as terrifying. When Midoriya interfered with their attempted abduction of Bakugo Katsuki, Dabi nearly burned himself to death with his anger. He had gone out for a, quote, walk to, quote, cool his head and ended up killing just about everyone he came across. Although Magna would never say this out loud, she was certain he was the reason the location of their last base was leaked. They weren't found for months on end, and then all of a sudden they're found after he goes on a rampage? Yeah, anyone with brains could see the connection. But no, Magna was positive no one else had noticed. Shigaraki was too pissed off by losing both his master and his, quote, rogue to the heroes. Kurogiri was never one to do anything without direction. Magna was pretty sure he was actually a robot or something. Himiko wasn't interested in anything other than stabbing. Twice has always had a screw loose, and the only thing he could even minimally focus on was video games. Spinner was too busy playing into his Stain cosplay. The only person Magna felt would even maybe listen to her was Mr. Compress. But she couldn't. Every time she tried to talk to him, she had a feeling in her chest, a squeezing sensation. She always jumbled up her words, and nothing she said came out comprehensible. Unless they were talking about the others, that is. Mr. Compress may have been a little too into his family line, but that is hardly unusual. You hear people talk every day about passing on their family traits and businesses. Magna herself didn't really see the appeal. Having grown up with no family and only a single friend put the idea of family in a different perspective. As she grew older, she began to think of the children she housed as her family instead. She was their big sister. Magna didn't lie to Midoriya when she said she signed up for the money. She really did need something to keep her building going. Without it, there would be more children out on the street, and she was certain they wouldn't survive. At least with the apartment complex, she would be able to guarantee that a small number of abandoned children would be able to make it to adulthood. It was something she never had herself. She would be damned if other children had to go through the same thing. Although Magna and Mr. Compress had spoken about how they were going to keep their teammates from killing each other, neither one of them were able to come up with anything that would actually get followed by their adorable little psychopaths. No, seriously, these kids were crazy, but they were also adorable as hell. Look at Dobby's hair. Doesn't it look so fluffy? Magna quietly coughed to herself to stop herself from laughing. She knew that she would have been the one to get weird looks if she started laughing to herself out of nowhere. But it's not like they had anything else to do. As it stood, they were currently waiting impatiently for Twice to bring back what he believed would be a powerful new recruit. They supposedly would even come with their own underlings. They would probably be put on the same level as the rest of them. Hopefully, they would be sane enough for Magna to talk to. Magna's musing was interrupted by a screech as the metal door leading into the warehouse slid open. Twice nearly skipped into the warehouse, followed leisurely by a man in a fur-lined coat. She sure hoped it was faux. And a mask in the shape of a bird's beak. Another man in a white coat with a full-face bird mask, and another man with shaggy black hair and no mask. He looked like a grunt. If Magna had to guess, she would say the bird mask probably marked the hierarchy of their group. Wait. Something about that sounded familiar. Magna turned away, hid herself behind Mr. Compress, and smacked herself on the forehead. She couldn't let Twice see her reaction to his choice, because the people he brought were probably the worst choice. It was the freaking Yakuza. They didn't have any sort of accomplishments to their name. They were a product of a dying time. All their members would probably be old men who sat around a card table talking about their glory days. Well, at least they could make them look more powerful, even if it would only be a bluff. You couldn't even bother to clean before inviting guests over, the man in the fur coat said, looking like he was about to swipe his glove-covered hand across a discarded box, only to change his mind and put his hands back in his pockets. Well, I'm here. Let's get this over with before I get sick by standing in this filth. Magna tightened her arm around her Magna in anger. How dare he badmouth their home? Doesn't he watch the news? Did he not watch as their bases got demolished by All Might? How rude do you have to be to even mention something like that? They hadn't even been here long. They were still in the process of making the second floor into a suitable living space. Twice. Good job. You brought us a big fish, Tomura said, lounging atop a pile of boxes. Wait, what? Magna did a double take. That's right, Fur Coat said. Magna could tell he was giving them a derisive smirk under his mask. You're Overhaul, the young master of the Ch43-44, Tomura said, seemingly not noticing the tone their leader was talking in. Magna was certain if Tomura truly had the necessary presence of mind, he would not be as calm as he was. What is the Ch43-44? Magna heard Himiko ask out loud, not bothering to tone down the volume of her voice as it echoed in the vastness of the warehouse. It's a Yakuza group, a relic from a time when villains had to work in the darkness, Mr. Compress answered. Overhaul shrugged. So what? Are you trying to make a comeback now that All Might has retired? Magna asked. Overhaul looked Tomura in the eye while answering Magna. Actually, we have experienced the most growth due to All for One being out of the picture. Tomura bristled at the obvious insult at the arrest of Tomura's sensei. There is no longer a king in Mustafa. Be it in the light or the darkness, Overhaul continued, I will be the next king. You are welcome to join me. Wrong! I will be the next king, Tomura yelled back. You couldn't even appropriately utilize villains like Muscular, Moonfish, or Stain. What makes you believe you have the makings of a king? Tomura jumped from his pile of boxes with a scream. Magna saw Tomura fully intending to start a war over the insult to his authority. Magna jumped in front of Tomura towards Overhaul. She could not allow Tomura to fight. If he did, he would bring the entire building down on top of them. Having to relocate yet again in such a short amount of time would not bode well for the mental health of the others. She lifted her magnet above her head, intent to bring it down upon Overhaul. Overhaul quickly removed his hands from his pockets and used his right hand to jerk the glove off his left. Magna activated her quirk, causing Overhaul's head to make contact with her weapon. Overhaul brought his left hand up and scratched Magna across the forearm. In that moment, Magna knew she had made a grave mistake. She could feel as the bonds between her cells fell apart one by one. The feeling of her body simply falling apart raced up her arm and began to spread across the rest of her body too quickly for her to react. The faces of her family, her siblings, flashed through her mind one last time. The last person she thought of before her world turned black had green hair and wide eyes. I'm sorry, Midoriya. It looks like I won't be able to give you that home after all. Izuku looked out the window. His afternoon classes were nearly identical to those in the morning. The core classes for the day were almost over, and his classmates were getting ready to attend their practical hero class. Izuku wasn't allowed to attend yet. They were afraid he would be too tempted and refused to sit still. Well, joke's on them. He had actually been practicing as a hero, according to the HPSC, so he didn't need that class anyway, just like he hadn't needed any of the other classes he sat through that day. At the ringing of the bell, Izuku waited for the room to clear before standing from his desk and packing his bag. Izuku paused, his bag thrown over his shoulder, and stared at the ceiling. He heard a giggle come from behind one of the ceiling tiles. He continued to stare until it slid sideways, revealing the small mammal that is the principal. Principal Netsu jumped down from the ceiling and landed gracefully on the desk next to where Izuku was standing. Hello, Midoriya. How was your first day? Netsu asked. Izuku shrugged. Ah, I see. Well, the teachers have reported you seem to have difficulty staying attentive. It seems the material is too easy for you. Ectoplasm was especially excited to report that. He tends to get a little too into teaching sometimes and tries to teach material far beyond what is needed. He was simply tickled pink when he said you answered one of his advanced questions correctly, although I did have to reprimand him about that. Nedzu giggled. That's right, I told you. I don't need to come to school. Izuku responded. You may be plenty smart when it comes to academics, but you still have a long way to go when it comes to interacting with others. Izuku gave him a disbelieving look. I don't think that's necessary. I have been doing just fine working on my own. Nedzu nodded in agreement. That is true, but I truly believe you could be so much more effective when working as a team. After all, it was the teamwork of both yourself and All Might that took down All for One, the most notorious villain in history. Izuku made a face as if he was drinking that medicinal soup. He didn't want to admit Nedzu was right. He was quirkless. That meant he had limits. At some point, he would come across a villain he would not be able to defeat on his own. He came across All for One months before he actually fought him and knew that he would not have survived had he gone against the villain alone. And that is why, Nedzu interrupted Izuku's musing, I would like you to intern with me. What? Izuku asked. Nedzu nodded. During the time you would normally be in classes, you will instead come to my office and we will work on polishing up the skill you have already started to develop. Izuku's eyes widened. You mean, that's right, Nedzu said with a smile. You can continue your hero work as long as you promise not to do it on your own, he said with a knowing eye. I thought you weren't supposed to have cameras in the students' bedrooms. We don't, but thank you for admitting it. Nedzu smirked. Izuku slightly blushed and looked away. Your internship will start tomorrow. Come after homeroom for paperwork and orientation. Nedzu jumped from the desk and trotted out of the classroom. He stopped at the classroom door and turned to look at Izuku. Have a good night. I look forward to working with you. Izuku walked out the door after Nedzu and headed towards home. Home. That was a weird thing to call the dorm because he knew that's what it was supposed to be, but it didn't feel like it. It instead felt not quite like a prison, but more than a hotel, although he had never stayed in a hotel before. The closest place he had ever lived that actually had felt like his home was the rundown apartment on the bad side of town. Izuku sighed and looked up at the blue sky. He wondered how Magna was doing. Hopefully, he would be able to go back one day. Maybe he could talk her into letting him help out with funding the apartment building. He would have to talk to her secretly the next time he saw her. End of chapter.